High Court rules the first flight to Rwanda deporting people who've arrived here illegally can go ahead next week. Ministers say the scheme will discourage asylum seekers from crossing the Channel, but opponents who challenged the plan in court said their fight will continue.
This isn't in any way a vindication of the Home Secretary's policy. That is still to be tested in the courts in the next few weeks. It is simply a decision related to the flight on Tuesday.
The court granted permission to appeal, and the case will be heard again at the Court of Appeal on Monday, also tonight. Boris Johnson urges ministers to do everything to free the 2 British men sentenced to death by Russia for fighting in Ukraine.
We have a breach of the Capitol!
Last year's Capitol riot in the US. A congressional inquiry hears claims that Donald Trump orchestrated the attack in an attempted coup. 40 years after the end of the Falklands War, we look at the psychological toll on those who fought. And the sprint star Dina Asher-Smith tells us of her plans to compete at the Commonwealth Games in Birmingham.
And coming up on the BBC News Channel, England had a decent start, but New Zealand had taken the initiative by the end of day 1 of the second test at Trent Bridge.
Good evening. The government has seen off a legal challenge to stop its first flight deporting asylum seekers to Rwanda planned for next Tuesday. Campaigners and immigration charities went to the High Court today to try to convince a judge that the Home Secretary Priti Patel's policy is unlawful and irrational, as Rwanda is unsafe. But the Home Office argued that there was a significant public interest in the government being able to deport people deemed to have entered the UK illegally. Here's our Home Editor, Mark Easton.
Is it lawful to give people seeking asylum in the UK a one-way ticket to Rwanda, telling them to pursue refugee status thousands of miles south in East Africa? The first migrants are due to make that journey next Tuesday, with campaigners today failing in their legal bid to stop the removals. The High Court in London heard from Home Office lawyers that 6 asylum seekers who had been due to be deported have had their removal directions cancelled, but the judge was not persuaded to halt the flight carrying 31 others, dismissing arguments that the policy is unlawful. The government welcomed the judgment. Campaigners said the fight goes on.
No, it's absolutely not a landmark day, and it's important to note this isn't the substantive hearing, so this isn't in any way a vindication of the Home Secretary's policy. That is still to be tested in the courts in the next few weeks.
The lawyer representing those trying to stop next week's flight, Raza Hussein, pointed out that the Home Office has repeatedly claimed that their Rwanda policy has been given the green light by the UNHCR, the UN agency responsible for the Refugee Convention. That's misleading and incorrect, he told the judge.
The United Nations has used Rwanda for...
Priti Patel has consistently claimed her deal with Rwanda is lawful under the Refugee Convention.
This agreement is comparable with all our domestic and international legal obligations.
But in court today, a barrister for the UN told the judge the UNHCR in no way endorses the UK-Rwanda arrangement. We've informed the defendant that it is unlawful. Not just once, but on numerous occasions it was claimed. After the deal was signed in Kigali in April, the UN had 2 meetings with Priti Patel and told her the arrangement broke international law. The government's legal team, however, interprets the convention differently, noting that more than 10,000 asylum seekers have risked their lives crossing the Channel in small boats already this year, and arguing there's a significant public interest in a policy that will deter people from making those journeys and undermine the activities of criminal people smugglers. Around 100 asylum seekers are now in immigration detention, threatened with deportation to Rwanda. In Brook House, near Gatwick, some have been on a hunger strike. One Syrian spoke to the BBC. A translator has voiced his words.
I came to the UK because it's the only place I have connections to. My brother, my uncle, and my aunt live here. If I end up in Rwanda, my future and the future of my 2 kids will be destroyed.
The Home Office had always expected a legal challenge, and welcoming the High Court decision tonight, the Home Secretary insisted she will not be deterred. However, campaigners have been given permission to appeal against today's judgment, the matter to be decided at a hearing on Monday, just hours before the flight to Kigali is due to take off.
And Mark joins me now. So, Mark, you've made clear there will be an appeal against this decision first thing next week. But the wider policy is also going to be tested.
I think so. So Mr. Justice Swift, the judge in the case, said there was no evidence that allowing this flight to take off on Tuesday would lead to ill treatment of asylum seekers or human rights abuses. But he wasn't ruling out a judicial review of the whole Rwanda policy. And I think many lawyers expect that to happen at some point. And if or when it does, from today's hearing, I think it is going to be about the legality, the lawfulness of that policy. As we heard, the UNHCR believes it's unlawful. The Home Office's lawyers, their interpretation of our obligations, the UK's responsibilities under the convention is different. They think that the Rwanda deal is lawful. One thing I'm hearing tonight is that maybe actually quite a few more people who had been warned of deportation to Rwanda who've now had those orders cancelled. And if that's right, then that suggests that there's perhaps something of a rethink going on inside the Home Office as to who and how many asylum seekers would be eligible for sending to Rwanda.
Mark, thank you. Mark Easton there. Boris Johnson has urged ministers to do everything in their power to secure the release of two Britons sentenced to death after fighting with the Ukrainian army. Aiden Aslin and Sean Pinner were captured and tried as mercenaries by a Russian proxy court in eastern Ukraine. Their families have called for them to have urgent legal and medical help. Our diplomatic correspondent James Landale has the latest.
Aiden Aslin and Sean Pinner from Britain, either side of Soudan Brahim from Morocco. All members of Ukraine's armed forces, all convicted of being mercenaries, all facing the sentence of death. These pictures show the two Britain's military unit on patrol in eastern Ukraine in 2020, 2 years before the latest Russian invasion. Both men talking openly about why they had chosen to live in Ukraine and serve in its army.
I've been here 2 years now, so and love it. Made a life here, settled down, got a girlfriend in Mariupol, planning to get married maybe, and now I'm in the Marines in Ukraine.
In a sense, like it is like my war, because like even though I'm not Ukrainian, like this is on my doorstep.
But this court in Russian-held East Ukraine has judged both men to be mercenaries, a court not recognised internationally. We're not showing footage of the trial inside, but Russian state media said the men had a month to appeal. The Foreign Secretary Liz Truss discussed the two Britons on the phone this morning with her Ukrainian counterpart, Dmytro Kuleba. And in a tweet afterwards, she said the men were prisoners of war and the judgment against them was an egregious breach of the Geneva Conventions, the treaties that set out the rules of war. She's been ordered by Boris Johnson to do everything in her power to secure their release. But the Foreign Office has a dilemma. If it makes a noise and summons the Russian ambassador, it risks turning this into a bilateral row between London and Moscow, adding fuel to the false idea these two men are British mercenaries. So the emphasis instead is on helping Ukraine protect two of its own servicemen.
So there is nothing like this.
Ukraine's ambassador here told me he was confident the men would be released.
We consider these people as the part of regular Ukrainian armed forces and should be treated the same way as we are treating the Russian soldiers in our captivity. So we are preparing the exchanges, and at the end of the days they will be exchanged.
You're doing amazing. We'll do it together.
For now, high-level contacts between Britain and Ukraine continue. The Defence Secretary visited Kiev this week to meet President Zelensky and discuss Ukraine's latest military needs. And international pressure is growing too. The United Nations in Geneva voiced its concerns about the sentences and the fairness of the hearings.
Such trials against prisoners of war amount to a war crime.
So for now, the fate of Aiden Aslin and Sean Pinner remains uncertain. Their families are said to be anxious and keen to ensure they have access to health services and legal advice. James Landale, BBC News.
Well, the Ministry of Defence has warned that the devastated southern Ukrainian city of Mariupol, which is now under Russian control, is at major risk of a cholera outbreak. Let's speak now to our correspondent Nick Beake, who's in Kyiv for us. And Nick, a very grim morning this.
Yeah, Rita, the big concern is that the dire conditions in Mariupol, this city of death and destruction, are ideal for the rapid spread of this disease among the 100,000 people who are still said to be living there. Tonight, the Ministry of Health here in Ukraine have told us they actually haven't recorded any official cases. That's not to say they don't exist, but they say it's more a case that they can't do any testing there because the Russians are not allowing people in and out. This is a city where it's very hard to get any information from. Communications are poor. But earlier today we were able to speak to one Ukrainian woman, Anastasia. She said that her mum managed to flee a week ago and left behind a city where the corpses are not being buried, where rubbish is piling up in the streets as the temperature rises as we go further into the summer, where there are very few medical supplies, where sewage is mixing with drinking water, and any rations that the Russian soldiers are giving out are simply said to be not sufficient. So tonight, Russia may well control the city of Mariupol, but it stands accused, Rita, of failing to provide the very basic services to the very people it says it's gone in to liberate.
Thank you. Nick Beak reporting. More than half of all households in Britain have reduced their spending on gas and electricity because of concerns over the sharply rising cost of living. New figures released by the Office for National Statistics show that 77% of adults are worried or very worried about rising costs, with almost half the respondents saying that they'd reduce the number of goods they buy when shopping for food. Government figures also show that 22% of pupils in England now qualify for free school meals. That's up from 14% 5 years ago. And the cost of filling an average family car with petrol has hit £100 for the first time. Our social affairs correspondent Michael Buchanan reports now from Slade Green in South London on people now struggling to afford even the basics of life.
Once we paid out all our bills, there's nothing left. Nothing.
I've had a stroke of COVID-19, but I was fit, I was active, working, 40 grand a year, gone.
Don't do mashed potatoes, it takes too long for the gas. I've lost 2 stone because I literally just walk everywhere because I can't afford the fuel.
Running the Slade Green Food Bank can feel never-ending.
Simon?
Hundreds of people are fed from this small hall in southeast London each week. Families that once just about managed are now barely surviving.
My energy prices have gone up from £90 a month to £300 a month. I've got a car, but the MOT runs out next week, so I can't afford to put it through another MOT, so I'm going to have to scrap my car.
Michelle and her husband were laid off when the company they worked for went under during the pandemic.
I'm actually registered disabled, so when you do apply for a job, no one wants to hire me because there's so many able-bodied people out there. Heating's off. We all have a rota of when we're allowed to have a shower, so every other day we have a shower.
Unfortunately, we didn't have any butter left, I'm afraid, sorry.
But just as the need is increasing, so donations are falling.
I've got no milk and I've got no chocolate scoops.
Over several days, we regularly saw the food bank run out of various basic supplies.
Everything's going up in the shops, so not only are we seeing the knock-on effect of people not being able to afford to donate, but we're also not being able to go out and buy it ourselves because of the prices.
Slade Green is an area of relatively high unemployment and low wages. The lack of money creates stress. Domestic violence is a significant issue and mental health problems are rocketing. This small group meet up weekly for a walk and attempt to tackle isolation.
All my bills, gas and electric's gone up.
Sue Bailey, who suffers from anxiety, told me about the mental impact of rising costs.
Yeah, you do struggle, and that doesn't help your mental health. I mean, you try and brush it off when you're out and about with people, but then you go back indoors and you're sitting there, and that's when you start to think about it. And things like this, I think, do help.
Stretched finances create other health problems too. Eating cheap but often unhealthy foods is increasing obesity levels, while some people can't afford even basic medicines.
You're going to get more people coming in for paracetamol and that because they get free prescriptions where they can't afford a box of paracetamol. Not that we can prescribe that because obviously there's certain things that they can buy over the counter, but it's really, really hard for people to actually have that disposable income. Okay, well that's brilliant, thanks.
Ministers say they're protecting 8 million vulnerable families, giving them at least £1,200 this year in direct payments. But until that help feels real, many families will continue to struggle.
I haven't done washing for about a week and it's piling up because it's either you do the washing and you run out of electric, or you don't do the electric and you do the washing by hand. I'd never thought I'd be this desperate in 2022. It is horrendous.
More people need help getting food today than did so during the pandemic. A basic requirement to eat has become a daily, sometimes desperate challenge for many. Michael Buchanan, BBC News, South London.
Coronavirus cases have risen slightly in the UK for the first time in 2 months, according to official figures. Roughly 1 in 65 people were estimated to have had the virus last week, up from around 1 in 70 the week before. The small rise is likely due to 2 newer variants of Omicron. A report from the French government has blamed a chain of failures for last month's chaotic scenes at the Champions League final in Paris. It said the events at the Stade de France, which included police firing tear gas at some Liverpool fans, had damaged the country's image and raised questions about its ability to host major sporting events. Our Paris correspondent Lucy Williamson has more details.
10 days on from the chaos at the Champions League final, the first assessment of the French government on events at the Stade de France. It says police asked that signs directing people to an alternative entrance to the stadium be taken down days before the match, and that it would have been desirable to reinstall the signs once a train strike was announced. It also says an unprecedented influx of people without valid tickets rapidly overwhelmed security controls, and that this was the key problem on the night. The report makes 5 recommendations, including a requirement that fans use electronic tickets in future to reduce the risk of fraud. The report broadly sticks to the government's line that the problems here began with large numbers of fake tickets among Liverpool fans. What it doesn't address are claims that some valid electronic tickets also didn't work because of problems with internet access around the stadium. The Paris police chief is facing questions from several different inquiries. In the French Parliament yesterday, he defended police actions on the night.
The use of tear gas worked. I'm well aware that by doing this, people of good faith were gassed. There were people who were caught up in this crowd and sometimes even families. On behalf of the police headquarters, I'm very sorry about that. But I'll say it again. Unfortunately, there was no other way.
Honestly, I've never seen anything like it. It was so bizarre.
Tonight, Liverpool fans reacted to the French explanations.
It wasn't just small amounts of tear gas, it was relentless. Like, you would be running and then you'd run into more tear gas. And this went on for ages. By the time people got into the stadium, like, everyone had sore throats.
The chaos outside the Stade de France was filmed by fans on mobile phones, but footage from surveillance cameras inside the stadium was found to have been automatically deleted a week after the final, in the absence of any order to preserve it. The search for a clear picture of events is only leading to more questions. Lucy Williamson, BBC News, Paris.
President Biden has warned that the forces behind the deadly insurrection at the US Capitol last year remain a threat to democracy. His remarks came in the wake of an explosive congressional hearing that blamed the former President Donald Trump for an attempted coup, which sparked the violence at the Capitol in January last year. Our North America editor Sarah Smith's report contains some strong language.
We have a breach of the Capitol.
Never before seen footage of rioters storming the Capitol was designed to shock.
Because you'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength and you have to be strong.
As the committee promised to demonstrate, Donald Trump deliberately orchestrated this attack.
President Trump summoned the mob, assembled the mob, and lit the flame of this attack.
I mean, I saw friends with blood all over their faces. I was slipping in people's blood.
The first police officer to be injured in the attack described the sheer scale of the violence.
What I saw was just a war scene. It was carnage. It was chaos.
As the crowd chanted, "Hang Mike Pence," the vice president, the committee says Trump agreed with them.
Mike Pence, quote, deserves it.
Donald Trump has denied ever thinking or saying, "Hang Mike Pence," and on his social media channel says, "The so-called rush on the Capitol was not caused by me, it was caused by a rigged and stolen election." The committee will produce more evidence over the next couple of weeks that they hope will convince people Donald Trump conspired illegally to try and overturn the election. But they can't actually bring criminal charges against him. They're trying to convict him in the court of public opinion. President Biden calls the January 6th attack a brutal assault on democracy.
It's important to the American people to understand what truly happened and to understand that the same forces that led January 6th remain at work today.
Testimony from committee witnesses was used to show that Trump knew the election was not stolen.
I did not agree with the idea of saying the election was stolen and putting out this stuff, which I told the president was bullshit.
Even his daughter and senior advisor agreed.
I respect Attorney General Barr, so I accepted what he was saying.
Night. It is an historic evening.
The primetime broadcast commanded attention.
It shows Donald Trump at the center of a violent plot to overturn.
But it may not convince an audience who have largely made up their minds about who's to blame for the Capitol attack. Trump-supporting TV channels like Fox refuse to air the hearing live.
The whole thing is insulting. In fact, it's deranged, and we're not playing along.
5 more hearings will provide more detail about what committee members say amounts to an attempted coup in America. Committee members say they think there is still a very real threat to American democracy, that this conspiracy is not over yet. Donald Trump, of course, continues ad nauseum to repeat that big lie, the idea that the 2020 election was stolen from him. And worryingly, a large number of Americans seem to believe that. Polls suggest a quarter of people here think that it is true that there was fraud in that election and that Donald Trump was the real winner. And most concerningly, over 20 million adults agree with the statement that the use of force is justified to try to restore Donald Trump to the presidency. These are not people whose minds are going to be changed by watching 5 more congressional committee hearings.
Sarah, thank you. Sarah Smith reporting. Next week marks 40 years since the liberation of Port Stanley and the end of the Falklands War. But the conflict came at a high cost for some of its survivors, who went on to develop symptoms of what would eventually be recognised as post-traumatic stress disorder, including flashbacks, violence, insomnia and heavy drinking, as our special correspondent Alan Little reports.
Couldn't see my kids because I was a bit of a loose cannon, really. I wasn't a nice person in them days. And everything was taken away, you know, and that's hard. Come on, come on.
When Paul Bromwell came home from the Falklands, his life fell apart. For years he drank, he couldn't sleep, he was violent. When he realised others were also struggling, he founded Valley Veterans.
I started helping other people, and that's what I've done ever since. And that's where I started to mend myself as well. I started getting involved with the horses. That was massive for me because I found something that I could channel my mind into, you know, and the horse will give you so much. I sit in a corner, just listen to him munching the hay, and that chills me out. But also at the same time, I got the guys up here. We're all like-minded, we're out in the air, not hurting anybody, and we're trying to build something positive, you know, and the guys and the conversations we've had in our little room in there, amazing.
This is the Erskine Veterans Village near Glasgow. It's home to hundreds of former servicemen and women. For them, 40 years is the blink of an eye, and they commemorate the experience still. After the Falklands, a long, slow evolution began in the way we think about war trauma. But back then, the stigma it carried caused many to suffer in silent shame.
I think it goes back to a long-standing view. But if you stay ill, then it's really a question of character. There's something wrong with you, and it's a weakness, it's a character flaw. That was a very common view in the mid-20th century, and you still see that was echoes of that in the 80s, 90s. It's very unusual to find that now, and I would actually say rather the opposite now. I think the military have had massive changes. We know that a considerable number of people in the military do come forward now with their mental health problems. Military have made major strides there. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it's much better than it was.
David Cruikshanks was a beneficiary of that change. He's written a book about his PTSD. He was just 17 when he came home from the Falklands. By his mid-30s, he was also drinking heavily. It took nearly 20 years for him to seek help.
I knew there was something going on. I didn't know what it was called. I didn't know how to explain it. I didn't want to tell anybody about it. I wanted to mask it. You knew something was wrong, but you didn't really want to admit it. And when that doctor said, I think you might have some sort of panic disorder or an anxiety, I'm going to refer you. And I remember that day because I just burst out crying. It was like a complete release. Oh my God, I do not have to pretend anymore, you know, and there's help.
I get so much out of this, for me. Personally, it just chills me out.
The vast majority of combat veterans do not develop PTSD, and many of those who do get better in time. But the Falklands generation is the last for whom the condition went, initially at least, unrecognised and untreated. They paid a high price for that. For Paul Bromwell, recovery began with the discovery that he was not alone, and in the company of old comrades. Alan Little, BBC News.
The former Northern Ireland football manager Billy Bingham has died at the age of 90. He'd been diagnosed with dementia in 2006. He'd played for Northern Ireland in the 1958 World Cup before leading the country to 2 successive World Cup finals, winning a famous victory over the host Spain in the 1982 tournament, which remains one of the sport's biggest upsets. Billy Bingham, who's died at the age of 90. A 17th century ship which sank off the coast of Norfolk has been found. And experts say it's the most important maritime discovery since the Mary Rose was raised 40 years ago. The Gloucester ran aground off the coast of Great Yarmouth in 1682, nearly killing the future king, James Stuart. The wreck's location was unknown until it was discovered by divers after a 4-year search. Now, she's the fastest British woman of all time, but she's seen her training disrupted by the pandemic and her hopes of an Olympic title at the 2020 Tokyo Games ruined by injury. Now, Dina Asher-Smith has confirmed that she'll be competing at the Birmingham Commonwealth Games, where she'll be one of the biggest names. She's been speaking to our sports correspondent, Laura Scott.
The world champion from Doha.
Dina Asher-Smith is used to living life in the fast lane, but summers don't come much busier than hers, with the potential for 3 major championships. Winning won't be easy, as she found out last night in Rome, finishing 3rd behind 2 Jamaicans. She could face them at the World Championships next month, and then in Birmingham at the Commonwealth Games, where she's just committed to compete.
Quite frankly, it is a very uniquely British challenge for the summer, because obviously we are the only nation that falls into the categories of the Worlds and the Europeans and the Commonwealth Games. But, you know, I see it as a fantastic opportunity. We've got 3 back-to-back. You've just got to go for it and enjoy it.
Has she been eliminated?
Hampered by a hamstring injury, there were tears in Tokyo, but Asher-Smith is desperate to bounce back.
Given those setbacks, what would constitute a successful summer for you?
Just winning stuff, quite frankly. Yeah, I mean, I was quite unfortunate. I had an unfortunately timed injury last year, very frustrating. But yeah, I just want to come back and run some really fast times and be successful across the track season.
Asher-Smith said she feels part of a golden age of women's sprinting. But despite the talent on the track, she said work needs to be done to improve how female athletes are treated.
There is still a humongous pay disparity. There's still a humongous gap in female coaching, female staff behind the scenes. And whether you are front of house, so the athlete, or part of the team behind the scenes, everybody should always be treated with respect as well.
And she's going to take the gold medal!
The fastest British woman in history isn't about to slow down. Having reached the heights before, she's primed to peak again when it matters most.
Dina has done it!
Laura Scott, BBC News.
That's it from us. There's a first look at the papers now on the BBC News channel, but now on BBC One. It's time for the news where you are. Have a very good night. Bye-bye.